All right, everyone, we'll get settled. So we have a couple of things to do before we bring up our lunchtime speaker. I hope that you enjoyed the breakout sessions, that you attended, that you got an opportunity to network with the speakers. Excellent. Let's give those presenters a hand. So now that we reconvened in the main room, and I really hope you also got an opportunity to participate and view some of the posters this morning, because those ideas, those concepts, those findings really hopefully has sparked some conversation for you all and next steps in terms of new projects that you may want to pursue. So we've tallied the actual judges' scores. And Mina Nababi, who is here on stage with me, served as our poster session director this year. And so what we're going to do is actually announce those winners. We had 3 categories this year, research, advocacy, and what was the other? Yeah, huh? Thank you, conceptual framework. Thank you. Elena in the back letting me know. So we actually have a small token of appreciation and gift for those individuals who have won in those categories. We actually have 2 individuals from the research category who scored very high. So with that being said, when I call your name, please come up to the stage to receive your small monetary award. It's a Visa gift card for $25. So you can use it how you wish. And also we've got a couple of people in here taking photos. If you want to do that, you can. So first up in the research category is, and please help me say your name, is it Siobhan Polian? Whose title of her poster was Social Media as an Instrument for Improving Health Literacy and Health Behaviors in Glaucoma. Congratulations. Sure. You can stay right there. Okay. All righty. Next up in the research category is Jermaine Mitchell. Barriers and facilitators of a community lifestyle intervention to reduce CVD in rural African Americans. Congratulations, Dr. Mitchell. So those were our 2 in the research category. All right. Next up in the program evaluation conceptual framework category is Emily, help me pronounce the last name, Blajaz? Is she here? And the title of her poster was Building Community-Based Research Through Community Coalitions. Is Emily in the house? Okay. Did she leave? Did she? Are you presenting on her behalf? Okay. All right. And lastly, in the category of advocacy initiative, Amy Badham and Tessa Graham, bridging the gap between water resource education and Bama kids. Is anyone here from there? Okay. Awesome. Cheryl Thedger, okay. Accepting on their behalf. Let's give, again, our poster winners a hand. You all did an excellent job. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are now entering the afternoon portion of our agenda, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our afternoon keynote speaker, Ms. Diane Bell McCoy. Ms. Bell McCoy, or Diane, is one powerhouse of an individual. She effortlessly connects people to each other. She serves as a civic leader, an organizer, and a change maker in Baltimore, Maryland. She originally hails from our nation's capital, and her work focuses on racial disparities in Baltimore and across Maryland with an emphasis on economic equity and the workforce. She's a master's trained social worker and has a natural gift for hearing people and began to shape her career around work that addresses social change. She was encouraged by her parents to be inquisitive and use her natural talents to help others. Her mother was the first African-American director of the White House Office of Mail Analysis, which is a distinction that she is incredibly proud of. And some ingredients that Ms. Bell McCoy deems critical to addressing inequities includes listening, having the courage to address systemic and structural racism, and lastly, equipping people with the access, opportunities, and relationships to change their lives. Please join me in welcoming Diane Bell McCoy to the podium. And lastly, if anyone has lost a key, I have it here.
Good. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Two things I want to share before I even begin, and that is, don't believe all the hype about Baltimore. So let me just say that. I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the remarks, and I also want to begin by just saying that, this is really a wonderful, and I'm honored for this opportunity to actually come to Birmingham Day and have this conversation with you, which I hope will also be a conversation. But I'm also very mindful that this is really a tough time to be a keynote speaker, and I'll tell you that I was trying to figure out whether I was going to get to be the morning or the afternoon in terms of that, but it's somewhat dictated in terms of traveling today. But it's a tough time because I'm clear about sitting in an audience around lunchtime in terms of you've just had an opportunity to network with folks and you're eating and still eating in terms of, and so I know that when you think about public speaking, and I've done a lot of public speaking in my life, there's a whole set of expertise that will tell you what you should do when you're going to be a speaker at difficult times like lunch times or a meal setting. And they'll share with you that you're actually supposed to begin your public speaking with a joke. And so be clear, I won't do that. I don't know any jokes, and I'm horrible at telling jokes. Or they tell you you're going to begin your public speaking with a story, kind of a personal story, leading into the core of your remarks. And so I will tell you that even as I begin this story, that I'm also going to ask for your patience today, because I'm going to share some comments with you in my remarks that may make you feel a little uncomfortable. And so I share that with people before I begin, that sometimes change comes with discomfort. And so that's a part of who I am as a change agent, both in my community and when I travel across the country. But I want to begin in terms of very much appreciate comment to me in terms of having known kind of what my comments would be about, but also urging me to also begin with sharing a personal story. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey in this work. And I will tell you that this is a little unusual for me to share this information about my journey, because I tend to be very focused on what the facts are, and simply the facts are the facts, right? They speak for themselves. Well, we know that that's not always true either, but I tend to stick with the facts. But so here it goes as I prepare to undress in front of you. So I'm a passionate, card-carrying advocate for African Americans and using the facts, equally passionate about changing the health and wealth outcomes for brown and black people. Because I'm very clear that that can change, factually, the economic health for America. It can actually be good for America, and it's about time we began to focus on those clear racial, health, and wealth inequities. That by most of you in this room, in terms of I'm in an academic setting, so that I know that you know by 2030, America will be largely a majority country. And I don't know if you know some of the projections that have been made that if we in fact paid attention to those racial, health, and wealth disparities, if income of minorities were raised to an average of whites, the U.S. earnings would increase by 12%, representing $1 trillion. Closing earning gap right now by 2030 would increase the GDP by 16%, $5 trillion. I will tell you, when I began this work in Baltimore in terms of focusing this conversation almost 10 years ago, we used an economist to do an economic implant analysis in terms of to share with my corporate relationships in Baltimore what that would mean for the wealth of Baltimore. And it was something like $600 million could be accomplished in terms of changing that. And I will tell you, at that time, it is different now, that when I had that conversation about what it could do to change Baltimore in terms of the paying attention to the health and wealth disparities racially, that I will tell you that most of the time the eyes glaze right over. People found that hard to believe that that was something that could impact. But I apologize. I promised that I would disrobe, and I stopped my disrobing. So let me go back to continue that, to talk about my personal journey that ignited my passion about the value and greatness of African Americans. Because the narrative in America doesn't match the facts about African Americans. Except for those great exceptions that we talk about, those first, those people that have been there singular all along. We kind of acknowledge that, but I'll be clear that my personal journey, coupled with a high dose of the era I grew up in, and I'm about to tell my age, not exactly, but when I say what I grew up with, you'll know, a high dose of James Brown, I'm Black and I'm proud. And for those of you in the room who've never heard of James Brown, and I know as I look across the room the ages may not have, this thing, I urge you to Google him. But my personal journey led me to know that Black and brown people are not automatically broken. And if you had not assimilated and kind of into the American way, there's a sense that Black and brown people were broken. But I'm clear, both my personal journey and factually, they are not a wholesale group of people to be fixed. Through the journey, I learned that systems and institutions that do not know my community often make a determination about who we are and what is best. I know that policies and institutions design the world using a universal truth, a universal lens thinking this will help all. And that truth is based upon others' experiences and others' truth, often not my truth. And I will tell you, this is where I really disrobe. I was suicidal as a young adult and deeply depressed, but academically strong. Academics were my lifeline. As a young adult, I sought mental health services. Look, I was an MSW, despite an educational experience in graduate school that felt pretty racist, but I'll pass on that story. Needless to say, unlike many in the African American community, I was not fearful of seeking help. The therapist was a white female, trained by the very best and with the best credentials. I was quickly diagnosed according to the DSM, which I understood she needed to get paid by the insurance company, and that was the rule book. But she also had supporting evidence found in research based on her racial profile and based upon my family background. Needless to say, I found the therapy ineffective. I was still deeply depressed. Fast forward, I found an African American therapist who helped me uncover and acknowledge my gift. She helped me uncover and discover how my gift impacted the world around me and what message I was incorporating into my psychic from that very world around me. Again, fast forward, I was no longer clinically depressed. I began a journey where, to this day, I use a different set of lens on the world. And I have a constant set of questions when one says this is the standard truth about people of color. Aided by my excelling in my academic engagement, I remember the lessons about systems and the impact of systems on the lives of families. I began to research and explore the systems and institutions that directed and guided the lives of people. I discovered the differences in how they impacted Black people versus white people. Prior to the 1990s, Blacks lived where they lived among whites based upon the economy of America. They lived near their owners. Post-1990s, the economy shifted, and there was an opportunity to move away from the Negro. But as the Negro gained resources, my city, Baltimore, was the first to enact an ordinance for preserving order, securing property values, promoting the interests, and ensuring the good government of Baltimore City, to be followed suit by other cities passing the same ordinance. It was declared illegal in Kentucky in 1917. Only to go on in terms of the Federal Housing Administration regulating and trying to encourage additional housing in America actually created places where loans could be made and where you want best practice of loans and best investment. And they actually colored different communities, and they colored communities of color red, redlining. Just a little bit more of the history and the systems and institutions that build America and establishing the patterns of housing, living, and financial assets that were foundation of America's middle class. This was the result of good government policy. Post-World War II created housing and thus home ownership opportunities for GIs returning home. We all wanted that. We know in our lives right now the value of a home and building wealth and assets. So, there were, of course, Black GIs. So the question we asked, why didn't Blacks benefit from that policy made to help GIs? Why didn't they create, in fact, a Black middle class? Housing that was built for whites, and integrating housing was not an option. Even the support for GIs for college education had a racial exclusion impact. A Black GI could attend college, but it had to be a land-grant college, better known today as HBCUs. So I could cite a long list of historical federal, state, and local policy that served to create the disproportional wealth and health for African Americans, but I will not today. But I'm clear, I'll send it back to you if you want that list. It's been my journey. It's been what I focus my career on, is understanding the history. I want to end and urge in terms of, as I talk about this section and I stop and I don't share more of those facts, I also urge you to Google that and to look more back in terms of what the policies of our country created today. And the purpose of that is that be clear that policies and practices created the world that we have today and continue to do so. And I'm clear, I have not touched upon the civil rights era, many people will say, and how, be clear, it did not permanently alter the systems and institutions. Nor have I talked about the racialized issues found in the social service systems or the child welfare systems or those well documented in the criminal justice system. We're in an academic setting. You know all of that. The level of inequities is found across systems. And having had the journey that I had and continue to look at the world for different lens, I could either decide or help people decide that Black and brown people were inherently broken, or I could help people understand the systems that help deliver the racialized inequities we see today, and the systems that continue to produce those same inequities. My conclusion was, if we want change and not just the color around the edges, but change that can ultimately benefit all of us, regardless of our race, we would have to continue to understand and address institutional and structural racism. I know that's not an easy set of words to be heard, and I know it's not an easy journey, and it's not a journey just by looking back. In terms of, we often, in settings I go in terms of people do have the conversation around structural racism, there's a sense that that was yesterday. And I want to make sure that you heard me clearly that we're talking about systems and institutions and policies, and systems and institutions and policies exist today. And I want to describe the health and wealth disparities as racialized disparities in this country. I did not say wealth and health disparities as it relates to poor people. I didn't say that. I said racial. I make that point because in the world I come from, if one is to solve a problem, at least that's what I was taught, one must be concise in defining it. There are clearly documented social determinants of health, And they're clearly research documenting racial health disparities that are very much based upon race and not income. And I'm in a setting in terms of, and I'm sure more than one doctor in the room, in terms of we talk about breast cancer as an example, where we know that white women are slightly more likely to get breast cancer, but African American women, regardless of income, are more likely to die from it. I want to make the point that it's not just about income. We often exchange this conversation because we're afraid to have the conversation around race and structural racism. We want to go to poverty. And I will tell you that's not your focus. It is certainly all the policies that exist as it relates to creating poverty in this country, and certainly a part of that conversation. But be clear, you must call it for what it is if you want to solve it. And it is around racial health and wealth disparities, and not just relegated to urban communities. So if you want to solve it, where I come from, you've got to get to the root issue. So with all this said, I'm going to share with you what I believe, my journey, my career, what I believe you need to go about this. I will describe it as a maybe 3- or 4-legged stool, with each leg representing a tool to bring about sustainable change related to those health and wealth disparities. And I'll tell you how I remember them, and I'll offer it to you to remember, as I remember them by the 3 Ps, or the 4 Ps. The first leg has to be acknowledgement that health and wealth disparities is racialized, and it's very much driven by systems and institutions. And it is about systems and institutions. We have to acknowledge and understand institutional racism and not be afraid of looking at those words and tackling public policy. So the first P is policy. I'm not advocating for just good public policy as it relates to public health, but also what I know that each one of you in this room already are doing and are already aware of. You understand the intersectionality of public policy. When you're focusing on health and those health inequities, you know that relationship to housing. You know that relationship as it relates to employment, because you had a workshop, I believe, just before this. You know that relationship and the interconnectedness in terms of policy to every one of these issues. And that you cannot simply stop at this point and focus just on the point of health as though that is the answer. I would also tell you that what we've developed and use, actually is used in Seattle, slightly different version in several other cities now across the country. People began to question the issue of public policy and identify those policies that are racialized and give both legislators, business owners, and others a tool to pay attention, to look at those policies before they actually get adopted or even after they're adopted. And so we have something we developed called 10 Essential Questions for racial equity policy development, where we now are training legislators and policymakers on how to use those 10 essential questions. One of those questions will be simply, how does this policy disproportionately impact people of color? Just ask the question before the policy is passed. I'll give you an example in Maryland in terms of by asking the question, and again, policy is developed, you know this, universal. We develop policy in this country with this universal lens, with the belief that, well, it's good for me, so it's good for everybody. That's not true. And so a very example, because it's not always intentional. Let me be clear, let me back up in terms of talking about this. This is not about somebody is racist. Do not confuse structural racism with somebody is racist. That is not this conversation. Policy, now let me stop, and my definition that we use in terms of structural racism is an organized system, whether through conscious intention or unconscious systemic implicit bias, that is interwoven into institutions and systems of social structures that characterize, ranks, and differentiate, allocates desirable social resources to socially defined races. Structural racism creates both individualized and systemic barriers for people of color. Now, I want to give you that, and I want to go back to it's not about intentionality sometimes. Example in, say, Maryland would be driver's license, the laws that govern driver's license. Simple, pretty simplistic. It's about public safety. And in fact, the laws that govern driver's license in terms of requiring the state of Maryland for someone, regardless of age, that you actually had to have X number of hours behind the wheel with a licensed driver. That makes perfect sense. You also had to have X number of hours with a driver's education program. Note, and I'll state, driver's education programs are no longer taught in school. Disproportional, we were able to prove to the legislators what that did to people of color. What that did, in fact, when you look at where the jobs were located, and the fact that most of the state of Maryland, actually in terms of people, jobs were 40 minutes away and they were using their own transportation, they were driving. In areas where there were disproportionately people of color, you had a challenge in terms of transportation, and then you had this policy that said you had to have this or that. So if somebody's also coming out and been in jail, coming out of jail, and they're now 40 years old, it still says they had to have the same number of hours behind the wheel to learn to drive as somebody who was 19. Well, it turns out the legislators' intent was only focused on that younger population. That was their intent. Helping them understand that disproportional impact, they changed the law. So again, it's raising the question, having the conversation, being willing to have that conversation, using data to direct that conversation becomes critical. And so we're now creating a policy institute in terms of helping join by legislators that have used the tool. In fact, now using it in our city to actually create a new policy around, for developers, around using a tax incentive. They will have to answer those 10 essential questions. The goal is to get to the system, to change the future outcomes so that we're not still standing here, maybe not me 30 years from now, but somebody that looks like me having the exact same conversation. So that's the first P, it's policy. The second leg of one of you're already deeply engaged in, and I know that you're doing it well, and that is community engagement. And it is about, the second P for me, is process. And I'm sure that you're doing all the right things right now in terms of ensuring that the community is very deeply engaged in this work. That's the purpose of this. So I know that the voice of the community is the expert. I know that you all view the voice of the community as the expert as you're addressing any of the disparities, and that the community's voice is not an afterthought. I'm sure you understand ways that technology, or not, can limit access. You probably have also already established what I call rules of engagement, so that with every university community partnership and those partnerships, they were all designed by all the persons around the table together, and not just the power at the table. I'm sure the community led that effort, because that would be best practice. And that they help, and what rules of engagement allow you to do is to help a frame of reference to also deal with conflict. Conflicts are natural. They happen when groups of different come together. For those in the audience that are married, there's rules of engagement in our marriages. But there are ways that allows you to frame that before it begins. But I also know that you have to have a person or people at the table at every one of those partnerships. And that role as a person to be clearly defined, to act as a translator, to ensure accountability. And I say translator because we use different language. We use different language when we come together. And all of us in the room who are professionals, and depending upon your profession, I'm sure that my good doctor, I don't know half the stuff you can talk about in terms of sitting in a medical arena. And I'm sure there are things that I say that certainly in my arena that may not be known. Can you imagine, and I know that you know this, the importance of somebody paying attention to language and paying attention to that disconnect that happens when you use language at a table with people coming from different backgrounds. And so that's also important to pay attention to those power dynamics. Power dynamics is a part of partnership. And so that's the intentionality of making sure you've got the rules of engagement, you've got clearly articulated, not just said out loud, but brought together. I will tell you that I give you this information, I give you this particular information in the history of using things like rules of engagement and having the community at the table. I give that to you from my journey of having led the most successful empowerment zone in the country. It was successful as it relates to engaging and empowering the community. If those of you that remember when the empowerment zone were around the federal $100 million that the first 6 cities got, there was a great deal of conflict in many of the cities. Some cities I won't name didn't spend all their money. They couldn't get over the conflict between the community, which the policy said had to drive it, and you had to have government, and you had to have corporate, which my community called the suits, at the table. We quickly learned we weren't any different in terms of that inherent conflict, that we had to figure out a way and make sure that this was in fact driven and allowed for those sectors to come together. And so the tool of having rules of engagement allowed trust to be developed and grow. And who designed the rules of engagement? The community. I pushed back on my corporate partners and said, we need the community, and then we need to be responsive. But we need to know what's important for them to bring at the table, because they just trust us. And because luckily I had a relationship with much of the community, and I had a growing relationship with corporate, and I'd been in government for some time. And so that was an important tool to use to allow the community and the suits in government to find out. And what they discovered is they really had a shared vision, but they had to get past the language difference. They had to figure out how to understand that. And they had to be able to hear each other. I'll share with you what I was asked to share a little bit about in Baltimore in terms of with Johns Hopkins, both university and medical system, and there are 12 different anchor organizations. We have an anchor strategy, probably it's being touted as probably one of the more successful in the country right now because there's so many anchors at the table. And they've come together to use their economic assets to benefit the community. Hopkins leads this effort in terms of as one of the leaders as it relates to using our economic inclusion to drive the agenda forward. You would probably ask me, so is Hopkins or the anchor institutions using this tool? And I, being who I am, will tell you, no. I will tell you that I continue to be the fly in their side about it, but I continue to be the fly in their side in a different kind of way because I've got a relationship with the president of Hopkins. I've got a relationship with every president of every major institution in the city. So I sit at the table and I say, why isn't the community at this table? You want to do good, but they'll share with you behind closed doors. Some of their challenges, they're a little concerned about brand. They're a little concerned about being thought of as negative, what that will do to their brand. Or they're a little concerned about not being able to control it. So we're working on that, how to begin to help them move forward. They've begun to take some steps in terms of having community in different conversations and the discomfort. I won't name which institution at this moment because it's confidential, but we're actually working with leadership in one of those institutions and taking their leadership and coaching them around racial equity. White, male leadership that will say to me, I really don't understand this. I know there's an issue there, and I know we've got issues of privilege in this institution, but I don't know how to deal with it. And not knowing how to deal with it, I'm frightened to even begin to have the conversation. So we're coaching. Another institution at the table who clearly gets it in terms of their corporate white leadership is a white female who came from the corporate world before she went and got her PhD and led this university. And she said to me when I first met her, she said, you know, I'm a white, fat female. As a white, fat female, I get it. I know how people look at me. I know how people respond to me. So I would be absolutely, if I'm trying to prepare a population of students for the workforce in this region, I would be having my head in the sand if I didn't understand the need to pay attention to racial equity and structural racism in my institution. And so differently for her, she opened up her door and her entire cabinet. We're now taking them through actually 2 months of training. She's hired a person to be focused on this issue. She's began to look at her system to see where her system is a part of delivering the inequities in education. This is also an institution where students actually took that issue on long before she got there. But again, she was very clear because of her own experience, this was important to pay attention. And I know that this is messy business. It's messy business because it's also uncomfortable business. But I always say it's so important to pay attention to this process. That if we want a different set of outcomes, that's really going to benefit all of us. And I don't know anybody in this room or any other room I've ever been in that says they don't want it. That we don't want to focus on those shared goals. But what it means is that we've got to be willing to challenge our institutions. We've got to be willing to challenge the process. And we've got to be willing to allow ourselves to be challenged if we want something different. And that is a little bit about the third leg. The third leg is about transactions. So I talk about this work of changing health and wealth disparities in two different levels. Policy is really around transformative change. Transactional change is really around direct services to impact specific health issues, including the preventive services. And I know that you're doing great work. I know there's a lot of focus on this in the medical. I know it's really important work. But I label this leg as people and programs. But I'm going to push back and tell you something. You got to be careful with this leg because it's not the answer. It's an important leg. Don't get me wrong. Changing people's lives, whether it's focused on a health issue, whether it's focused on a workforce, changing individuals, programs that help people move from negative point to a positive point. That's really important. Even the research that's done in that space is important because it's going to change some other lives down the road. This is where people can be saved and individual health outcomes can be altered. And with evidence-based practice, I'll give you an example in Baltimore. We've been able to lower infant mortality for low-income mothers. Baltimore, that translates into Black mothers. It's a great thing. My question at a table we sit at where we are having this conversation, the we is all the foundations in the city, government, state, and local, as well as our institutions are having this conversation. So we're celebrating these outcomes, and I'm celebrating, and I'm happy about them. And I will celebrate all the program outcomes as organizations make a difference in terms of workforce or any one of the other areas. But I will tell you I challenge them. Because what I know, because I've done this, what I know having spent $100 million in terms of empowerment zone and successfully and document every single dime that we spent and can tell you exactly to this day, because we use data, I can tell you to this day where people are working because we track wage record data and I can look at those wage records through the state right now. I can tell you exactly, but I can tell you the systems didn't change. Lives change, absolutely. And we make that mistake too often, thinking that if we just change this, many people will have this conversation around having, doing economic development in communities. And if we just focus on changing those economic outcomes, housing, and then make sure people in the community get employment, then people will actually want to make a difference in those communities. And then we can change the physical development of the community, and then we can have great communities. And I will tell you, that's a fallacy. That's American dream, that's a fallacy in the sense of depending upon the level of disinvestment in a community. I don't know about you, but I can tell you about me. If I lived in a low-income America, deeply disinvested, and the time it takes to physically change a community versus time it takes to individually help an individual move forward, whether it's a health issue or wealth issue in terms of employment, I might move to greater opportunity for a job where I was before. And the physical disarray is still around me and all the challenges, and I have children. What decision am I going to make? What decision are you going to make? You're going to move. So the point of all this is to say, be clear. Let's not sell ourselves fantasies about changes, but this is about the issue of investing, in transactional investments. So it's important to do that work, but you got to ask the second question. What do we know about the upstream? When we're talking about the issue of infant mortality, I say to Dr. Nguyen, tell me what systems are impacting the lives of these mothers if that service becomes necessary. Tell me how do we disrupt that system upstream. Tell me how we change that. Tell me how we identify that upstream. And yeah, it may be too hard for her, but aren't we all at this table purposefully so we can disrupt the upstream? That how do we reduce the need for this program versus often what we're at the table is trying to figure out So how do we get more money so we can keep doing more of this and more? And I'm like, I'm only willing to help you get more money to do more of it if you're willing to focus upstream. Because I know what I know will be at this table 20 years from now, having not touched upstream. And so when we find that system thread, that we make sure that we are not unintentionally creating another level of systemic racialized barriers. You got to pull that thread. You got to go upstream. You got to pull it. You got to find it to figure out how do we stop even the need for that. So you use the data that you find in health inequities to move it upstream and determine what's that causation. But the same place about transactional, about people and programs, this is also another hard one to have the conversation around. Because it also means that you got to look at yourself. You got to look at yourself, and you got to look at the system in which you lie in. You've got to look at the system you're employed by. You've got to look at the system. And the question I would ask, and I say this all the time in terms of unless you, in fact, are willing to pay attention and look at that issue, then it's not likely get to systemic changes. But that's now, actually I skipped forward because that's now about the fourth P that I realize I've got to always talk about, and that's the personal. And that personal and their role inside of the system and the personal side of where you sit on the issue. And are you willing to have this conversation? Are you willing to put structural racism on the table? Are you willing to have that conversation in mixed company? For those in the audience that African Americans, I cannot believe that you don't have that conversation with your peers. The question is, do you have that conversation with people that don't look like you? When that conversation is uncomfortable, you got to push past it. Discomfort is not a negative. It's about a growth in terms of how do you look at that. And not just have it as a conversation. This isn't about a conversation. This is about beginning to actually look at where systemic issues lie in your system. And for some organizations willing to have the courage, and it takes courage. I certainly don't like looking at my faults. I don't have any, but I don't like looking at them. So it takes courage. There's an organization that we led and pushed forward in Baltimore, one of the largest workforce organizations in the state. About 5 years ago, I began pushing them. Actually, it's called Humanum, one of the largest, most innovative workforce organizations in the state of Maryland. They have several social enterprises. They do phenomenal, phenomenal work. They asked me 5 years ago to sit on their board. And I said, I don't sit on all white organization boards. That's not who I am. That's not my values. I have my own personal value statement. I live by it. They challenged me and said, that's not who we are. I said, but this is the facts. This is the facts. That is who you are. They began to go forward and said, if we're willing to look at ourselves, if we're willing to go through this journey, will you come? We want to do what's best for the persons we serve. They had just moved into the city. They had been largely in the different counties in the state. They moved into the city and they really wanted to make a difference in the lives of African Americans. So we began this journey 5 years ago. They went with my colleague and myself to Denver, Colorado, where Denver, Colorado Foundation had a program helping communities understand the impact of race, structural racism, implicit bias, and having them figure out how they could have that conversation with organizations they were interacting with because it was impacting the bottom line. We came back from Colorado, the leadership of Humanum, the president, first vice president, myself, and my colleague. They had a workbook that they had developed in Denver Foundation. They came back with a workbook and they said, okay, we're ready. Okay, we're gonna use the workbook, we're ready. No, you're not ready. You still don't get it. But we agreed to go forward and do some education, training for the board, the entire board of the organization. We agreed to go forward and actually do training for the staff to help them understand and uncover really what this is. They actually agreed to create a committee on racial equity to better understand. This is an organization, as I said, one of the largest in the state. They have over 800 employees at all different sites. Tough. About 2 years ago, continuing to push, I said, you really need to do a racial equity analysis of your organization. Because it was a good, well-meaning people who happen to be white, who are phenomenal in their commitment, no negative in their heart. They hadn't had a person of color in a leadership position in their entire history, and this is a 40-year organization. There's no negative in their heart. They really wanted to do what's best. Henry, the leadership for the organization, agreed if they did the racial equity assessment, they told the staff that they would, in fact, share it with all of the staff once they completed it. We gave them ABC gave them a grant, my organization I work for gave them a grant, along with Casey Foundation, which is a partner for me, and to help them hire someone to do the racial equity assessment. That's pretty brave to take this on. And it's really brave for the leadership to say, when it's done, we're going to share this with every single staff person. Racial equity assessment was complete. I think it took maybe 4 or 5 months. And it was complete. It was presented to them, presented to Henry, to the leadership. And I would tell you, I think it was Cindy, in terms of I wasn't there, cried. They discovered they had structural racism built into their organization. Wasn't intended. Their policies and how they move forward in terms of recruitment, their policies in terms of who had opportunity to get promoted, their policies, because they were done in a universal way, really led them to understand they had some bias built in their system. I will fast forward that story to say that I am now the board chair of Humanum. That they got very clear, and the reason, this is an organization that served persons with disability for many years. And Henry would say he got very clear, just as they had to go and deeply learn and understand the disabilities community to the best possible, they owed it to understand African American community that they were now serving to make sure they could serve it best possible. And so thus led. And so there's a whole set of recommendations. They're moving that forward. Henry often becomes my poster person that I can take out, but I'll tell you in terms of they got clear in terms of themselves. One last story around the personal. There's another effort we've moved forward where it's called the Aspen Baltimore Group, partnership with the Aspen Institute and Baltimore Community Foundation and ABC. And in this partnership, 6 years ago, we came together to do some training around structural racism. It was 3 days away. And this was corporate civic leaders, white, black, and they were a little hesitant about doing this training. Was this going to be the same old, and my white colleagues, somebody going to call me racist? No. It really is about structural, helping them understand that. I will tell you that out of that came, I have a bank president. I had 2 bank presidents at the time. One, unfortunately, is deceased now. Along with the Casey Foundation president, host of leadership went through this, and the group continues to exist today. The bank president continued to grow in her knowledge. We use the convening 4 times a year just as a safe place to have this conversation, as a safe place to go deeper on issues. She used that opportunity to, in fact, get clear she wanted to promote more people of color in management and leadership in her organization. And she realized she couldn't do that unless she also insisted that her staff create an implicit bias training. She's now changed her numbers of people of color in management and leadership. It's about the outcomes. It's not just about just to do it. So I would say that the question that I would ask you to ask yourself, is how does this show up in your world? Harvard researchers documented that racially biased decisions often occur subconsciously. Again, this is not about somebody being explicit or racist. Don't hear that. But it is important to look at yourself. It is important to ask the questions inside of your institution and surface it if you want to see a different outcome. Because you may believe, although we're all here to help, you may in fact be part of the problem unknowingly. And so the question is, how do you make sure you're not part of the problem? But you also can't remain on the sidelines. And you have to be willing to risk your own privilege. So I would say you've got to learn to push and be an advocate and look at policy and review that. I would say you want to use data. But I'm going to come to an end right now. I know we'll have time for questions. But I'm going to end with portions of a note from a native son of Alabama. He is now deceased and was a husband of a woman I serve on the Baltimore Community Foundation board with her. She shared this with me very recently at a lunch meeting we had. He was asked by a friend about Selma after the movie came out. This is a man who grew up white, Jewish in Alabama in the 1950s and 1960s. His father was a prominent Montgomery business person, civic leader. They were a pretty big deal in a small townish way, he would say. They had comfort, security, certain prominence, plus attainment of assimilation. He grew up as a Democrat, liberal, sympathetic, kindly to Black people, he said. His family was not brave or courageous, nor willing to risk their own comfort for a greater cause. He says in many ways, he felt worse about his behavior looking back. He says, I know I was not at all brave, but kind of gave myself a quasi-pass because his heart was in the right place. However, the words that still make him cringe and feel shame are those of Martin Luther King. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. And I would end with saying, and from me to you, we're all in this together. You want to address those health inequities. And clearly they're related to wealth inequities. We as a country will lose the legacy of a bright future unless we understand and face this issue today. Thank you.
All right, wow. I was noting and tweeting and noting and tweeting, and I think I got all of the P's. Let me make sure that I do. It's a policy, process, people/programs, and personal. All right. Thank you so much for that. I mean, the work that Ms. Bell McCoy is doing in Baltimore is absolutely amazing, and I'm so excited to know that you're on that board now. And that you do stand, you have your own personal value statement that you do follow. That's very important. We're going to open up the floor to some questions for her now. So if you do have a question, there's a mic in the middle of the room. So if you'd like to come up and ask your question now, you can. Don't be shy. All right, first up is Dr. Crook.
I really appreciate your comments. They were really powerful and moving. And when you made your comment that, this big effort you had with the Empowerment Zone, you changed the lives of people, but not the systems. And, that was actually fairly sobering. And so the question then, I wanted to go back and revisit that. And the question I have for you to at least contemplate today, and maybe we can discuss here in the audience, is about those upstream processes and, one, identifying them, and then two, change. I mean, those are, I'll go on to say that, there's clearly discussion out there that in some of those cases, those neighborhoods may not be able to be saved.
That's right.
Right? Those neighborhoods in which those folks are moving out of, once they have opportunity, once that brain drain is gone, that wealth drain is gone, you're really even left with less behind. So I would just appreciate your comments some more about these upstream issues, and are there times when we might need to say we need to close up shop, let's move everybody away to perhaps to a different environment where there may be better opportunity and those upstream issues aren't there?
So my answer to that is yes and no. The yes is without adequate wealth, without adequate economic resources to make that difference and make that difference in such a way that it also can be led and directed by African Americans or whatever the minority group is? Their answer is yes, that's what you ultimately end up doing. But what happens, and we see this everywhere across the country, you end up with that much disinvestment in a community in terms of neglect, benign neglect sometimes by government itself, when that happens, that you end up then kind of opening up for developers in some ways that then begins to turn the community. And so that's the conversation in terms of that, the issue of gentrification and the issue of that. So what are the policies that can also support that development, that can even support that community, that may be a community of color? That would also, one, as I indicated you, the 10 essential questions that's going to be embedded in the policy for developers that are going to come after any kind of tax incentive in Baltimore. Most cities use tax incentives in a big way. We've got Under Armour in our town, that big tax incentive. But having them have to do something different in terms of it may even be an equity partnership at a very significant level with African Americans, very significant in terms of ownership, in terms of with some of that community. So if you policy addresses that wealth disparity, in terms of it can change that, you can also don't have to give up the community. But if you don't have an intentionality with that, yes, for the benefit of that community, for those individuals, that maybe all you can do is say, we've got to let it go. The project around Hopkins Hospital, in terms of lots of conversation that was well intended between Hopkins and Casey. And so I was a part of that effort. I was on the board. But the challenge of that, in some cases, we have the community push back around halfway through the relocation, push back and said, we want our houses here redeveloped. And so they said, okay, we'll figure that out. So that some of the community got moved out, some got a chance to have their housing redeveloped, and they're still there. So that challenge now is that community is now blooming and booming, is how to blend that. And so all of it offers challenges if we don't pay attention to that intentionality that happens when we make policy and how it's going to impact. One last example I'll give you that we just launched, it's a part of our advocacy space, but we just launched a effort of creating a called Baltimore's African American Home Builders Cooperative, which will have home ownership for African Americans, intentionally built by African Americans. And I'm a part of the founding group to launch that. It's modeled after the group out of Florida. And I will tell you, as we push that, we see opportunity to do that, particularly around home ownership. And our white developers have largely, community CDCs have largely focused on rental housing. We're saying we know from a standpoint of, you can actually do this for African Americans in terms of that. But I will also tell you that just that push of saying we're going to do this for African Americans, since we know that's the majority in that community, I will tell you that I've gotten more than enough negative emails and calls. Why must I do this for African Americans? Come on, somebody else has got to have a question.
All right. Well, thank you so much for these remarks. I think important words that need to be said. You must realize, and I think you mentioned that you're sort of preaching to the choir here, but how do you reach those who do not want to hear, who do not want to participate, which in the end, I think are the ones who you really want to have this conversation with? So
it depends in terms of the example I gave of the Aspen partnership, Aspen Baltimore. Laura is a woman's name who heads up the bank. So Laura and I met recently in a lunch meeting and talking about how do we bring along some of the corporate players. And so we actually are developing a strategy. Part of this is being intentional strategies. I have another belief, comes from my experience, that you cannot achieve change without an inside-outside game. And everything must be strategy. I don't play unless it's a strategy. And so the inside-outside game is, in some very intentional way, in this case, for those corporate leadership, civic leadership that may be a little uncomfortable, finding those that are comfortable with it, but those that have been converted and begin to move in that direction. So using myself as a tool, this is not something I advocate to anybody to do, so let me say that. So I'm on 12 boards. I'm on 12 boards in a very intentional way. I'm on our Greater Baltimore Committee, which is our corporate board, which for the region. I now just got elected. I'm on the Maryland Hospital Administration Board of Directors. The purpose of that is to begin to infiltrate and to use relationships and to ask those that are already there to bring their colleagues along. Because our colleagues, and I want to be clear of this is not a conversation around white or black. in terms of the conversation around structural racism. When we were pushing forward the idea of policy and to call out the issue of structural racism into the barriers for workforce in the Maryland region, the greatest pushback that we got not to have that conversation publicly was by African Americans. Be clear. It's about the status quo and being uncomfortable with changing the conversation. So by using people that are comfortable, in this case, Laura and others, asking them to begin that conversation with our colleagues. This is now also an agenda for Baltimore Community Foundation that I was able to push. They now have a racial equity framework. Very conservative board. They're now beginning to have that conversation. It's a strategy. Use relationships.
Comments, really appreciate those, and I love the upstream focus. So 2 vignettes to share, one positive, one not very encouraging at all. One was in South Carolina, we were working with homeless health care. And we learned that one of the biggest barriers is the legislature prohibited the spending of public tax dollars on anything but public housing. Mm-hmm. We couldn't develop transitional housing, we couldn't do vocational programs. So when we learned that, we started some advocacy with individuals who were served by different agencies that had helped people with homelessness. And we learned that the only way to get the legislature's ear was to start bringing carpools of people to the Capitol and making noise. And it worked. After some time, because we worked under the visionary, like you said, find your voice. Our visionary was Mayor Riley, who at that time was the longest serving mayor in the United States. And he saw it as an economic issue. So he gave us the platform and the space, and it ended up changing legislation. That was a positive. A negative story, we were trying to improve school health services and programs in Selma. And we engaged youth. And youth through Photo Voice wanted to take pictures of their community and their schools to show us what was wrong, which we did. And the school board would not accept it. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to talk about it. They literally publicly shut the youth down. It was very, very discouraging. It took lots of effort to recover from that because the youth lost interest. They felt they were so disempowered. So maybe you could make a comment on some educational activities or programs that you have found successful for youth. Thanks.
So I feel like I'm pretty blessed in that space where I live right now. After the uprising, we have a number of very engaged racial advocate groups that are millennials and even younger that are very much in this conversation. There's a group that actually called Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle that actually is teaching, and it teaches debate in terms of, because from the research, they were all debaters in college and high school and went on in terms of understand that changes. Leadership often are people that have gone through debate teams is what they understood. They've become the voices. So it's not my voice, using another group of young people who are closer to their age to have that conversation with them, to help them find their voice again, to help them find the tools. But the other thing I would say, having also been on the school board, okay, I told you I was on too many boards, on the school board was also, my question is also, is the school board elected?
Yes, they were, and we had the superintendent's blessing. He was shocked that his principals were on the side of the board and didn't want the change.
Yeah.
So they didn't want to change the status quo in the lunchroom. They didn't want to change physical education programs. They didn't want to change staff development. He could only get the buy-in from some of them.
Right. So say for me at that point, I would, so the Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle right now in terms of the issue that's come up in Baltimore, we wanted this youth fund that they got. Also began to using from a standpoint of getting, so a strategy. So sometimes it's timing. You've got to be willing to wait in terms of as it gets ready for the next election for the school board in terms of social media. And using social media to tell the story about pictures in terms of this is what a room looks like that's healthy, and this is what a room looks like that's unhealthy, and guess where this room is? Oh, it's in our schools. So it's, I would say to you, hopefully the youth, there's other youth that are a little bit older that can help work with them. I would reach out to that because they'll hear that quicker than they'll hear you or me in terms of that conversation. I certainly will give you LBS's information in terms of that. But again, I have to be helped by my colleagues all the time to remind me that this is a journey. This is not an event, and this is a long journey. There are certainly days that I go back to my office or days I'm doing my consulting, and I go back and I say, okay, I'm quitting. I'm done. I don't feel like doing this anymore. I come back, and I do apologize. I am so transparent, and I am so who I am. I come back and say, I don't want to talk to another white person. I'm clear. That's what I say. I'm sick of it. And then I'm clear, okay, that's not an option. You got to keep pushing forward.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I think that last comment is a good segue into my question about getting community really involved or educated in the construct of government or policymakers or whatever, so that they're better empowered to even desire to be a part of what has to happen to make communities transist. A lot of time it's a hero, if you will. And I always say that the more we look like Superman, the more they act like Lois Lane. So how do we empower communities so that they see the importance of being, of knowing and understanding what is the mechanism that we use to educate, if you will, communities to the importance of them knowing, so that the gap between what happens with government is a lesson, and then they understand more of what to expect. And so understanding that, they understand a little bit better about what to fight for, if I can put that on the question.
Sure. I would tell you from my experience that communities are already empowered. I would tell you that that definition is a little bit challenged, and that my question is always going to be, where does the community want to start? I don't care about government today because I'm really trying to figure out how to feed my family. I don't care about government today because I really got this issue going on. So I'm always going to say, let's start where community wants to start. If you start where I want to start, and you start around the issue of hunger, you start around the issue of housing, I can use that housing issue to help that community get a solution. And out of that solution, they'll learn the issue and the power of that. But it's always going to be start where the community's priority is, not mine, theirs.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to ask you a question on, okay, we just had an election. We had, and we're in the city of Birmingham, and in a civil rights city, we had 20% turnout, and this was in the runoff election. And I talked to people, and we are doing a survey now on asking the people. We pulled the van system, and we actually seen where the people actually didn't come out, the communities that they didn't come out. And I was going over today, and we're still calling, and I know that the people have lost all hope in the black public officials, and we already feel like that we figure out what the white ones want and what they're going to do to us. So even with the communities being North Birmingham with the pollution, those communities was put there to put black people in, and they built the houses to get their checks back where they worked for in that coke plant. That's the reason they put a liquor store there, they put a grocery store there, and trust to put a brothel so they can keep all the money back and get it spilled right back over into that company. But then, now, still, you see these so-called suburban areas building these big fine houses, they still doing it. 20 years from now, it's going to be a messed up plant put over there because you wonder, why is all this green area and no one is building there? Because they putting it there because they know we finna run over there, and they're going to build a big plant there and going to turn that community back into North Birmingham. And to get us to really understand about voting and the people who we put in office, because they look like you, don't mean they're going to do something for you. And to get the people that's in them to understand that this ain't no cow for you to milk when you get in office. You're here to serve the people. We got so many self-serving folks. But the community and people they're in denial about so many things. And I feel like, I want to know, do you think it's getting any better? I don't think it's getting better, personally. I think it's garbage, and the system is so screwed up, and they handpick us, and they know exactly where to put us at. and the ones that's gonna turn and stab us in the back, they know who they are. Those are the ones they put on the boards. Those are the ones that they give the promotions to. And it's sad, and it's getting worse. It's not getting any better, because no one in Birmingham want to have a serious talk about racism. Mm-hmm. You know, well, let's have a conversation. I can't have no conversation about you mistreating me and my folks. We got to have a serious talk. But don't nobody want to do it. You can't find a person to give the Community Affairs Committee money to have a seminar on racism. They've been trying to raise money, ain't got none yet from the corporate community, not a dime. Red Birmingham had to let that committee break away because he couldn't get no funding, and he would mess up, and he wouldn't been able to get no money from Red Birmingham if he had brought it. In the 21st century now you got Latinos moving into all these cities, but still black women and black people are being held down more than any race in America. Everybody want to holler about research and documentation. You don't hear them talking about that until President Barack got together with the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and did that study. And it brought out where black women was the #1 voters in the United States. Right. And we did what we supposed to do. When we told them we weren't going to vote for President Trump, we didn't vote for him. The white women went what? Went right on out there and voted for him. And then some of our black men. Mm-hmm. But we need to have a serious talk about this, and I think you need to be the guest speaker, somebody with some guts around here.
I would say a couple things, and I want to be clear that I don't want to portray myself as being the answer great, because I'm not. I raise a lot of questions and to try to push other people to look at those questions and answer it. But I'm going to take that on in a couple of bites. First of all, I think you're right. I think we're at a crossroads. I would tell you that all the challenges that Baltimore faces right now, using my city as an example, people describe in terms of the murder capital, competing with Chicago, talk about the uprising. I would tell you that I have more hope for Baltimore right now than I've had in 30 years. And I'll tell you I have more hope now because after the uprising, it really began to open some eyes. People that weren't willing to have this conversation before are now willing to at least have it, even if it's behind closed door. Our leadership, our youth leadership, I have a lot of faith in young people. I'm one of those people that absolutely loves being surrounded by young people. That's because I'm Peter Pan and I'm never growing up. But they really are the lead in terms of many instances, in terms of moving change forward. I think, though, the issue of apathy in a community is, as you described, it's about lack of trust. It's about what's happened over and over again. The community that you've heard on the news in terms of Sandtown, Winchester, and Baltimore, probably it was part of the empowerment zone. Part of the empowerment zone was a part of the effort by Jim Rouse. But let me be clear, I led all of those efforts. I led the Jim Rouse effort with Kurt Schmoke's administration. I would tell you lots of that community moved out. I would tell you that community that's left there now will tell you what I care about is I want decent housing. So again, I would say if you want community to be activated, you got to focus on what's important to them. I know that the vote is critical, but I can't have a conversation about voting if I live in public housing and somebody to fix repairs is threatening me to have sex with them. Unless I don't have sex, they won't do my repairs. Focus on that issue first. But also I think you got to have a community organizing strategy. And you may not be able to get the resources here, but it also resources in terms of nickels and dimes in terms of moving that forward. I'd also would tell you to look at the tools that do exist. I had this conversation coming over in terms of that I don't know if there are any bankers in the room, and I know I heard somebody earlier who's in housing who talked about their banking. But I would also tell you in terms of looking at the Community Reinvestment Act. So this effort I talked about earlier about the focusing on Baltimore's African American Home Builders Cooperative, we're actually pushing all the banks, and all the bank presidents are all my friends. They know who I am. Pushing around, asking them for MOU and focusing on an African American MOU with them around changing their investment in the African American community. And we're going to take it to the hill. And so we brought together the African American community groups, CDCs, nonprofits, and it's a model that they can actually make a profit by using a for-profit model. But I use existing regulations. So I think sometimes we don't use some tools that are available to us. So I know that somebody else talks about in terms of what's the requirement in terms of federal communications for your cable company in terms of their investment. Use the tools. It's hard to ask people to give you money and give you resources to also come after them. That's kind of hard. I do it all the time, but it's really kind of hard to ask people to do that. So use what people care about, what corporations care about. Use that, but focus first on what's important to those communities. I cannot begin to come out and talk about voting if I've been through this time after time after time and nothing's changed. Help me focus on something that's important to me. I may be able to have that next level of conversation. But you have to put some time in the trenches in terms of organizing and listening. Not what you, again, it's the same issue. Voting is important, we know that, but I don't want to hear that today. I want to hear what you're going to do about housing. You want to know what the most important issues are for that community. And they may not be what you think it should be. It may be something very different. That's got to be important first. When can you can pay attention to what people say is important to them? And again, I think you've got a lot of wealth in the youth community and millennials. I think if you look at social media for Birmingham, I would bet you will find a lot of activism there from young people. I will bet you that. Comb that. Look for those advocates among your millennials. Look for those, even your white millennials, who want to come and make a difference. We've got to come up with new strategies and not think we can do the same old if we want to change those outcomes. Changing around wealth building for African Americans in terms of, ultimately, that really is the only thing that's going to change it. What does that mean in terms of business development? What does that mean in terms of capital for businesses? Doing that research. Because again, capital for African American businesses is good for business, using those tools. But again, I would tell you to pay attention to the existing laws and policies. Use them for your benefit. And yes, you do have to have some very honest conversations about structural racism. You do have to put it on the table, and you have to put it on the table lots of different tables, lots of different places, and sometimes that may have to be closed door, a small group setting to have the conversation. Everybody's not willing to be confronted with it, black or white, but you gotta begin to have the conversation. I tell people, structural racism is the grand puppet master of all of us in this country. It's the grand puppet master. If we don't face this issue front and center, one last story I'll share with you in terms of I was sitting in a bank conference room, Federal Reserve Bank. One of the Federal Reserve officers came to give a conversation around the whole economic growth in the globe and was talking about the different parts of where banks and financial industry will go from a global perspective of their investment. And they talked about America, and this was probably at least 10 years ago. And they said that at the highest level of security in this country, there was a conversation going on about the future of America and America's security future. And it was determined, they were concerned, that if America didn't begin to understand the demographic shift that was about to happen and the need to invest in brown and black people, we were headed for disaster as a country because we were undermining ourselves. So there's a book in my head that I'm writing that I'll never write. But the book in my head is, can America save itself from America? That's the question. Thank you. Thank you again.
All right, is Doug Mullering in the house? There he is. So we're now going to transition into this part of the agenda called Cookies and Conversations. I'm going to let Doug tell you just a little bit about it, and then we're going to actually just move next door to Ballroom A is where we're going. So Doug, I'll let you speak to
Thanks.
this element.
So we've had a lot of powerful speakers giving us insights into how we can better help our communities. And so the opportunity that we wanted to present everyone is to carry these conversations into the next room and have an effect here. Let's all of our respective organizations, and some may be members of multiple organizations, have those conversations next door so that we can synergize and have an effect and be the legs on the ground for this effect. As incentive, we also invite anyone that has a business card to put it into the glass jar that's in the other room. There will be giveaways right before the closing announcements. If you don't have a business card, no problem. There are pieces of paper in there where you can put your information. And what we're trying to facilitate is to make these connections with the various organizations and groups that we have here so that we are better able to serve these various communities with the wealth of resources that we have. And they're varied and they are deep, but we need to know what those are. So help us to make these connections by taking the time to put your information in the jar so that we can continue to grow this from a regional level to a state level to a national level. Thank you.
All right. So if you'll just, take your things. Next door, we've got some cookies, some lovely cookies from the Sheridan, as well as some coffee. If you'd like to get some additional things to drink in the back, you can. But if you'll move next door, we'll get started with cookies and conversations. Remember to continue to tweet using hashtag CEI 2017. And again, we're on Facebook at Community Engagement Institute.